Jersey Network. New Jersey Network News with Kent Manahan.
Good evening, I'm Trish DeGaspers, and welcome to a New Jersey Network News special report, the Bradley-Whitman Senatorial debate. You're looking at a live picture of the Birchwood Manor's Grand Ballroom in Whippany, where in just a few minutes, the Democratic incumbent, Senator Bill Bradley, will face off with the Republican challenger, Christine Todd Whitman. Senator Bradley is seeking a third term in office, having won in 1978. He was re-elected in '84. Mrs. Whitman is a former president of the Board of Public Utilities and former Somerset County freeholder. The latest Eagleton poll had Bradley some 30 points in front of Whitman. This is the second and last scheduled debate between the two, with the focus on foreign policy. Following the debate, we'll have a special hour-long New Jersey Network News. We'll have complete debate highlights and analysis, as well as the rest of the day's news. And right now, we'll go to the debate site in Whippany, Morris County, where Kent Manahan is standing by to moderate the program. First, though, some opening remarks from the President of the Chamber of Commerce, the sponsor of the debate, Victor Pelson.
Good evening. I'm Vic Pelson, Chairman of the New Jersey State Chamber of Commerce. The debate you're about to see between U.S. Senate candidates Bill Bradley and Christy Whitman continues an important tradition, the tradition of televised debates between candidates for New Jersey's highest offices. The State Chamber has been proud to sponsor these debates as a public service for many years, and I'd like to thank the people of New Jersey whose interest has made them possible. Now, I'd like to introduce the moderator of tonight's program, Kent Manahan of the New Jersey Network.
Thank you, Mr. Pelson. Good evening, and welcome to the United States Senate debate. The candidates tonight I will introduce to you, but first I'd like to, before going over the ground rules, I'd like to introduce the candidates to you and the members of our distinguished panel. We'll begin, first of all, with incumbent Democratic Senator Bill Bradley of Denville and his Republican challenger, Christine Todd Whitman, former president of the State Board of Public Utilities of Far Hills. I'd like to introduce the members of our panel this evening. Jane Allen, the New Jersey correspondent with the Associated Press in Washington. Michael Aron, New Jersey Network News senior political correspondent. Bill Beutel, anchor man, WABC Channel 7 Eyewitness News in New York. Jim Gardner, anchorman, WPVI Channel 6 Action News in Philadelphia. Now I'll take the opportunity to go through the ground rules quickly before we get into tonight's debate. The program this evening will allow for each of the candidates to begin with a 2-minute opening statement, the order of which has been determined by a coin toss. We will then move on to the panelists, and they will have an opportunity to question each of the candidates. The candidates will be given 90 seconds for a response with 60 seconds for rebuttal. After the panelists' questioning, the candidates themselves will have an opportunity to question each other in a crossfire section of this debate. And then, of course, we'll have the closing statements, 2 minutes each also, all of which has been determined by the toss of a coin. Well, now that we have the preliminaries out of the way, I'd like to begin with the opening statements. And first, Senator Bradley.
Thank you very much, Kent. What happens in the world directly affects New Jersey. Thousands of jobs depend on our ability to sell our goods to other nations. Prices people pay for gasoline and home heating oil relate directly to a crisis 8,000 miles away in the Persian Gulf. Even the air we breathe depends on events beyond our borders. Global warming threatens our health as surely as toxic waste. And the fall of communism in Eastern Europe brings special joy to those New Jersey families whose friends and relatives have suffered under its tyranny. And it kindles hope in all of us that someday people everywhere will be free. I believe the nature of our leadership in the world is changing. For 40 years, our power derived from our ability to protect other nations from an obvious military threat coming from the Soviet Union. That threat is now receding. Our leadership will depend more and more on our example, on the health of our economy, and on the kind of society we build here at home. But as the Cold War ends, we will have more resources from reduced defense spending. The question is, where do we put them? I think that they should go toward reducing the budget deficit and restoring economic growth, toward better health care and education for our children, toward protecting our natural world, indeed, toward making New Jersey a cleaner, safer, more prosperous place. I believe America is great because it's free and because people seem to care about each other. Freedom and caring are the two inseparable halves of American patriotism. To preserve the freedom and to increase caring are the values to which I've dedicated my service in the United States Senate.
Mrs. Whitman? Thank you, Kent. And I'd like to thank the sponsors of tonight's event for making this possible. We are discussing tonight the problems of foreign policy in the world, of the changes that have taken place and that we've seen over the last few years, and their meaning. But we can't have an intelligent discussion about foreign policy without recognizing one overriding fact, and that is that the United States is the remaining dominant superpower in the world today, and that the engine driving the world's economy is ours. If Congress can't balance a budget, if our deficits hamper our abilities to compete both at home and abroad, that's felt throughout the world. If the richest nation in the world must close its doors because of lack of funds, that holds us up to ridicule throughout the world. If our Congress calls for sacrifices from everyone else, but won't cut back on their own spending or reform their ways, the international community shakes its head in wonder. This is an ever-shrinking globe whose interdependence is being constantly realized day after day. We must have leaders willing to lead, not to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on polls and not take positions on important issues like my opponent. We must have leaders willing to stand up to special interest groups, not to take their money while giving lip service to reform, like my opponent. In short, we cannot have the business as usual in our Congress while expecting to change the countries throughout the world. In the final analysis, America will cease to be effectively competitive in this world if we cannot change our ways at home. Thank you. All right, Jane, you have the first question this evening, and that will be directed to Senator Bradley.
Senator Bradley, just a few months ago, New Jersey's congressional delegation, along with the House Majority Leader Richard Gephardt, asked for trade relief to protect a New Jersey camera maker, Keystone Camera, against a flood of cheap foreign imports. You did not sign that letter, nor did you request trade protections. Will you explain your decision?
Yes, I think that the best way to remedy trade abuses is through the existing law and through multilateral methods. We have an international trading system in which there are safeguards and in which there are means by which complaints can be registered, and that is the way we should proceed. I do not think that the way we should proceed is providing special relief for an individual company. If a company is injured by imports, it can submit its request to the International Trade Commission, and the International Trade Commission will make a judgment as to whether that is justified. Congressional involvement in that process, in my view, is not productive. I think that the people who make the judgments should be making the judgments based on the facts, not based upon congressional pressure. And so I did not sign that because I did not want to intervene in a process which was fundamentally a process of regulation.
Time for your rebuttal, Mrs. Whitman. Well, I think there are definitely procedures in place that allow companies to appeal when they feel there's been unfair trade discrimination against them. And I think that what is the most important, though, is that we do stop our Congress from interfering on specific and individual cases. I think that's the kind of micromanagement that we've seen from the Congress that really hurts our ability to compete, beyond the fact that we are constantly hurting ourselves because of our economic situation here at home and our taxation structure. And I think what we have got to do is to get out to establish policies to try to use our Department of Commerce to be sure that we are able to compete on a level playing field at all times, but not to intervene on each specific company's case. Michael Aron, you have the next question for Mrs. Whitman.
Mrs. Whitman, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he was almost universally condemned for an act of aggression against a neighbor. He was quick to try to point out that the United States also had invaded its neighbor, Panama, just 8 months earlier, an invasion that caused hundreds of civilian casualties. If Saddam Hussein were here tonight, how would you explain to him the difference between what he did and what we did?
I think it would be useless to try to do that explanation because I don't think he'd hear it. I don't think there's any comparison between what happened in Panama and what Saddam Hussein has done in Iraq. I think what we've seen in Iraq, the way the President has brought the international community to bear, is a testimony to that. What you have seen is an international community that says it is the world against Saddam Hussein, not the United States against Iraq, that he is someone who must be stopped, and he must be stopped now. And that is the kind of thing that makes an incredible difference. We have a world community that agrees and supports the United States in this. I don't think there has ever been an occasion where anyone has tried to indicate that there's an analogous situation between what happened in Panama and what's happening now in Iraq.
Can I follow up?
Yes.
I think I'm trying to draw you into an analogy, and if not to Saddam Hussein, then how about to New Jersey school children? How would you explain what we did in Panama?
I think what we did in Panama was a response to an act of aggression on their part as far as our soldiers. There was a shooting right before we went in. We were dealing with a dictator who had been judged an international criminal because of the export of drugs through his country and his facilitating of that. He was someone, it's a country that sits on our border whose security is very vital to us. We were very concerned with what happened in Panama. The people didn't riot in the streets after we went in Panama. They were supportive of what we had done. You were dealing with a dictator who had not been fairly elected. He had just overturned a recent election. I think there's all the difference in the world. We were in Panama to support the people of Panama, and that's what we were about.
Mr. Bradley, your rebuttal.
I think the President has managed the operation in Saudi Arabia well from a multilateral standpoint, but I think he's made two mistakes. One is, I think that he didn't put a red flag up and warn Saddam Hussein that such an action could precipitate an American response like we've done. Specifically, we extended credits and subsidized grain sales to Iraq for at least 2 years prior to the invasion, dealing with a dictator who gassed his own people. And second, just days before the invasion, our ambassador at the direction of the State Department visited Saddam Hussein and said, when asked about a potential invasion of Kuwait, that it was an inter-Arab matter because we had no treaty with Kuwait. I believe there should have been a red light go on. If there was, I wonder whether Saddam Hussein would have intervened. The second mistake I believe the President made was that he didn't use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve soon enough or sufficient enough. We have lost $300 million a day for a number of weeks because of higher oil prices.
Senator
he could have
Bradley,
prevented
I have to stop
that by
you.
using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Moving on to Bill and your question
Want to
for
follow
Senator.
up on that one, Mike?
Well, while we're talking about Iraq and Kuwait, there does seem to be a great deal of confusion on the part not only of the American people, but on the part of the leaders of the American people, Senator Dole and President Bush, to name only two, as to why we are in the Persian Gulf on the level that we are there. Are we in the Persian Gulf to protect democracy, to restore, that is, the ruling family in Kuwait, to protect our oil supply, or to depose or assassinate Saddam Hussein, or a combination of all three, or maybe a fourth? Senator?
Well, I think that the President's stated objective was to protect the oil fields and to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait and to get a government restored in Kuwait. I think those are legitimate objectives. I think that he has moved to try to secure those, and the way I read the situation now is that we now have the United Nations having passed 5 resolutions that import sanctions as well as criticizing Saddam Hussein for taking hostages. And we now are seeing the sanctions begin to tighten. You see stories every other day about shortages of this or that in Iraq, and I think at some point they are going to bite. And the presence of American forces there is to tell Saddam Hussein that if he attempts to lash out, that it will be suicidal. So my hope is that the presence of forces there, plus the pressure on sanctions, can lead to our objective, which is getting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. I think that we should be actively seeking a diplomatic solution to this problem. And if we do actively seek a diplomatic solution, given the strength that is there, we could very well succeed.
If we do not succeed, a follow-up, if I may, if we do not succeed, if the sanctions, for example, on Saddam Hussein do not drive him out of Kuwait, and there are many indications, people say that it'll be 6 months at least before they really begin to bite, do we have an open-ended commitment there, or should we have an open-ended commitment to that section of the world and the way we're there?
Well, I think that's another one of the problems that comes from the events that surrounded this. People have high expectations that this is going to be over quickly. I think it's going to be more of a sitzkrieg than a blitzkrieg. And that means we're going to have to rotate forces there. That means we're going to have to make sure that we're prepared to stay for the longer term. And it's going to mean we have to pursue aggressively diplomatic solutions to this problem. I think that we can never rule out the use of force. No president should. But we hope that we'll be able to move to a diplomatic settlement, and that will take staying power.
Time for your rebuttal, Mrs. Whitman. I think we are clearly in Iraq for reasons much broader than to keep the price of gasoline down at the pump. I think one of the concerns we should have, however, and it was more expressed in your follow-up question, I believe, is that the Constitution didn't allow for 535 commanders-in-chief. The President is the commander-in-chief. I would be against what Congress is doing, talking about doing right now, which is trying to tie the President's hands and demanding that prior to any kind of military action, he get their permission. I think we all fervently hope for a diplomatic settlement, although I must say that I disagree wholeheartedly with former President Carter's proposal in the Time magazine of this week. We all hope for a diplomatic solution. However, if we have to move, if it ever comes to that, then I think the President is required by the Congress to let them know after it has occurred. But to tell him he can't move until it has happened puts the lives of all our troops there in great danger. Jim, it's your turn for a question to Mrs. Whitman.
Mrs. Whitman, many members of the American Jewish community were outraged when the United States voted to condemn Israel in the aftermath of the violence at the Western Wall in Old Jerusalem. The critics of that vote contend that our condemnation was, in fact, a transparent attempt to pacify the Arab states that have joined us in a coalition against Iraq. Is it your feeling that the United States was right to vote against Israel at the United Nations?
I think one of the things of which we must be very careful is to separate out the Israeli-Palestinian problem from what's happening in Iraq at this time. I think what happened at the Wailing Wall was something that was atrocious. We didn't want it to happen. I think it was an overreaction, perhaps bad preparedness, a lot of rumors flying around as to who was coming up and what was going to happen as far as building a new temple was concerned. And I think I fault the government of Israel at this point for not allowing the United Nations to come in and look. They're only asking questions. I think it's important that we understand that that kind of behavior is something with which the world has a real concern in a territory such as that. But I think we want to be very careful that we don't try to mix these two situations, because I think they are entirely separate, and I wouldn't at any point in time want to give Saddam Hussein any credit within the Arab world for having forced discussions on the Palestinian question between Israel and the Palestinians.
I'm sorry, but I have to repeat my question. Was the United States correct in voting to condemn Israel in the United Nations?
I support the United States vote in the United Nations, yes. Time for your rebuttal, Mr. Bradley.
I strongly disagree with the United States vote in the United Nations. I don't think that the facts are clear. There could very well have been a provocation. I also don't agree with Mrs. Whitman that the Palestinian-Israeli issue is totally separate from what happens in the Persian Gulf. In fact, one could argue that that could have been a provocation that had been fomented by Saddam Hussein so as to break up the Arab alliance that we now have in the Persian Gulf. So I think that the response indicates a rather superficial view of what is the Middle East and what are the problems of the Middle East and how you have to approach the Middle East. So I also simply want to say that any time Mrs. Whitman tonight invokes the name of President Carter, I will invoke the name of Herbert Hoover.
I'll take it. I'll stand by him. Round 2 of questioning begins with Jim Gardner addressing his question to Senator Bradley.
Senator Bradley, there is increased talk, even through the interpretation of dreams, so it seems, that Saddam Hussein might be willing to withdraw from Kuwait in exchange for those 2 Kuwaiti islands that would give him safe access to the Persian Gulf. And I suppose that such a withdrawal would bring a big sigh of relief to much of the world if he diffuses that situation. But there is another line of thinking. And that line of thinking, which I have read as recently as this morning by Daniel Pipes from Philadelphia in the New York Times, when he said that to go to war with Saddam Hussein now might be much less difficult than to go to war with Saddam Hussein in 4 or 5 years. His point being that if we don't make war with him now, we will inevitably have to make war with him when he is in a far stronger position economically and perhaps even with a nuclear capability. Is there validity to the idea that even if there is a willingness on his part to withdraw in exchange for those 2 Kuwaiti islands, that it may make more sense for the United States to defeat him now once and for all?
Well, I think when you think about deploying force, you want to have the full support of the American people and you want to be able to win. Those are the criteria. And if you look at what's in the Persian Gulf, you could say, sure, we should strike, knock out those nuclear and chemical weapons facilities now, knock out the other areas that could be problems in the years to come. And indeed, in maybe 72 hours, we could, with our air power in the region, knock out the air capacity of Iraq. But that won't eliminate the tanks. That won't eliminate the thousands and thousands of tanks. And there is no way that such an action can be taken very lightly. You don't rule it out. You never rule out force when you're dealing with someone as ruthless, with a track record like Saddam Hussein, a man who started a war, who then made peace with an enemy when he started another war, and who gassed his own people. You never say you're never going to use force, but you have to be sure that if you use force, you can win, and you can do it quickly, and in doing so, you get the full support of the American people. You don't willy-nilly move into a military conflict without knowing how it's going to come out. For example, what happens if Saddam Hussein's put missiles in the western part of Iraq aimed at Israel? What happens if he moves into Jordan, striking at the heart of Israel? What happens to our Arab coalition? What happens then if there are overthrows in the region and we end up being a power in Saudi Arabia when there's no Fahd, or a power in the area when there isn't a King Hussein in Jordan? We could end up being isolated in the Arab world with hostile Islamic regimes unless we're very careful.
Mrs. Whitman. Well, first, I'd just like to say, back to the question before that relates to this, I agree very much that Saddam Hussein would like to make the involvement between the Palestinian question and the Israeli question, and I think we ought to be very careful not to give him that kind of credit. I think he'd like nothing better than to shatter the international force that has been brought to bear on him by turning this into an Arab-Israeli conflict. I think that I'm very concerned about having to move in this situation with armed forces. But if we have to do it, I think it has got to be decisive, it has got to go for those military targets, and we can't stop halfway there. I'm not sure, I would hope that, as I said before, that we can come to a negotiated settlement. But it has to be one that involves their complete withdrawal, and I believe it should include reparations to the Kuwaitis for the damage already done to them. Bill, your question for Mrs. Whitman.
Away from Saddam Hussein for just a moment and to the American people, there is the beginning, certainly a sense of the beginning of doubt, strong doubt, Mrs. Whitman, about our presence in the Gulf. As you know, there were protests in various cities this past weekend. News reports from Saudi Arabia indicate very strongly and very clearly that there is some morale problem of some important size building among the troops, the American troops in the Saudi desert. Let me pose to you a hypothetical question. If by some unexpected electronic miracle some soldiers from New Jersey were to hear this broadcast, soldiers whose morale might be down on the bottom of the sand right about now, what would you, as one who would like to be their representative, say to them? by way of trying to boost their morale and give them a sense that maybe they're in the right place?
I think what you say to them is clearly they're in the right place. They're there for reasons far beyond the cost of gasoline in this country. They are there to stop, I believe, a megalomaniac whose next object would have been gone right beyond Kuwait to Saudi Arabia, and I think Israel. I think he wants to control the oil of the world, the oil production of the world, and thereby control the world. I think there cannot be a greater mission than what they're doing now, and I think the analogies between Saddam Hussein and Hitler are not far-fetched. And therefore, it means to us that this is a man who must be stopped. He has shown that he will resort to any kind of weapon at his command, and he doesn't care what happens to his own people in the course of that. So I think it is imperative that we show a strength there, that we're there with an international community. And that's the other thing to remember. They're not there alone. It's not the United States alone. It's the world there.
If I may ask you, by way of follow-up, the classic question, what would you say to the parents of these New Jersey soldiers if at some point their boys are sent home, to use the cliche, in body bags, dead?
Well, I have talked to many of the parents of our soldiers who have gone over there from New Jersey as I've traveled this campaign in the course of this spring, summer, fall. Mm-hmm. And that's never an easy thing to say to anybody, and no one ever wants to have to be in the position to say that. But what you have got to do, and I think the President has done a very good job of showing that we are not there for a spurious reason. We are there for the most deepest commitments that the Americans hold dear. We will not let one country override another, overrun another. We will not let this kind of raw, aggressive force go unchallenged, and we must not, and that's why we're there.
Mr. Bradley.
Well, if I'd ask the young New Jersey students, or young New Jersey soldiers, where they were from and what their favorite food was, and did it travel? And then I'd send it to them. I'd also tell them that they were defending liberty, as our democracy sometimes chooses in its imperfect way to find the need to defend liberty, and that just as those who were out in World War I and World War II and Vietnam and even that misguided action in Beirut in 1983, all were defending liberty. And I would then tell them that I hope that over time that this conflict could be moved to a more multilateral realm, more UN involvement. And I'd tell them that I would hope that they would be home. They would be home having achieved the President's stated objective, which is getting Kuwait, getting the Iraqis out of Kuwait and back in Iraq, and a government in Kuwait and the oil protected.
Michael, you have the next question for Senator Bradley.
Senator, I'd like to move the discussion to Eastern Europe if I can. Last spring, President Bush proposed sending $380 million in aid to the newly non-communist countries of Eastern Europe. You wrote an op-ed piece in which you said that's not nearly enough. You wanted to send in aid 1% of the defense budget. By my calculations, that's about $3 billion, or 8 times more than President Bush proposed. Given the new tax burdens on New Jersey citizens at the state level and soon at the federal level, do you still advocate sending 8 times more in aid to Eastern Europe than the President advocates?
No, we're at a watershed in history. A region of the world that was once communist is now free. It reaches out to the largest and most prosperous democracy in the world and says, how do we do this? And we respond with a pittance. Why is that? Because we've had horrible fiscal mismanagement for the last decade. We've created giant budget deficits. We are the world's biggest debtor. Every point along that road, I warned and voted against many of the actions that created this budget deficit. Now you have people like Havel in Czechoslovakia, Lech Walesa in Poland, people who live by principles because they have lived under a totalitarian regime that repressed them every day of their life. And now they're free. And what do we say? Well, $128 million. There are people in the state of New Jersey with family members from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, from Romania, from East Germany, who yearn to be free. Now, we don't have to send billions of dollars over there, but we have to make a bigger effort than we're now making. if our rhetoric about democracy and freedom mean anything. If it's just rhetoric, fine. But if it means something, we're going to have to back it up.
Well, you said we don't have to send billions. You had been advocating sending $3 billion. Are you backing off from that amount?
No, I'm not backing off for that amount. Over a number of years, $3 billion makes some sense.
Mrs. Whitman, your rebuttal.
Well, I think, Michael, you have to redo your calculations because the senator keeps saying that the major way to balance the budget is to cut the Department of Defense, so the 1% wouldn't be as much as you thought it was originally. And I think it's come down a little bit. We do see the Berlin Wall coming down. What we have still is a wall around Congress that doesn't allow for the same kinds of changes that we want to see and the same kind of thinking that's going on over there. It's ironic that the elections in the Politburo now are more competitive than the elections for Congress here in the United States. I think what we need to do is we need to send aid, of course, but more importantly, we need to send technology. We need to send the ability to use the aid that they get to create the kind of economies that they want to see. And they can't do that without more than just dollars. It's going to take more than dollars to solve their problems.
Continuing now with Jane Allen's question to Mrs. Whitman.
And continuing on the theme of the crumbling of communism in Eastern Europe, with those changes came revelations of absolutely deadly pollution in industrialized nations like East Germany, so that now when we talk about environmental problems, we really are forced to think globally. What role do you think the United States now has in restoring and repairing the blackened environment beyond our own borders?
Oh, I think we play a critical role in this sustainable development of the world as it's going forward. This is something where I differ from Bill, because I think we should have long since had a national energy policy and an international energy policy. We can no longer talk about just ourselves. It is an interdependence of the world. And I think what we've seen in Eastern Europe is what unbridled development and pollution can do to a society, and it's frightening. The best way to help what's going on, what we see in Eastern Europe, and prevent it from happening again in this country or in any other country is to have that kind of a global policy. We need to, as the IMF and the World Bank make their loans, and they are now looking more toward the definition of sustainable growth, to ensure that the kind of economies we're trying to develop are ones that are going to be based on the latest technology, that we try to have a policy that encourages alternate forms of fuel for South American countries so they don't have to cut the rainforest down in order to heat their homes. We need the kind of international commitment where we can be the leader, but we have to start right here at home.
Follow up?
For the immediate future, what would you do? What type of aid or kind of help can we offer right now while people are sick and dying in some cases?
I think that the kind of aid we can offer right at the moment is really, again, in the technological medical aid. They clearly need help. We also obviously need to take to them. When I say technological, we need to look at the kinds of scrubbers. We need to be working with Western Europe, because Western Europe is very much a factor in what happens in Eastern Europe now. The economic community comes into being, the European community comes into being in 1992. We need to be working with them to see the best ways to help Eastern Europe.
Senator Bradley.
For someone who believes that we need a national energy policy and a national energy plan, Mrs. Whitman is in a rather awkward position because as head of the Board of Public Utilities, she lets sit on her desk the state energy plan.
That was
so
because
for
the governor
someone
asked
who
for that.
talks about developing a national energy plan, when she had that chance in New Jersey, she blew it. Now, what I think about the international environment, frankly, the Bush administration should not have joined with the Japanese to sabotage an international effort to limit CO2 emissions. They should have led in that effort. The future is a commitment to cleaning up the environment on a global basis, and that requires U.S. leadership, not the United States shrinking back from that major responsibility. And finally, because she mentioned the balanced budget and the defense expenditures, she's for a constitutional balanced budget, but throughout this campaign, she has not told you how she would balance the budget.
Jane, in this go-round, you begin the questioning with Senator Bradley.
Senator Bradley, you once characterized American foreign aid to the Soviet Union as money being poured down a rat hole. Now that Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev has presented his new economic plan, are you still opposed to the aid, and are you satisfied with the magnitude of reform that he's presented to his people?
No, I'm not satisfied. As a matter of fact, about 3 weeks ago, Mr. Stalin, who is his chief economist who developed this plan, was in my office. And my view all along is that the Soviet politicians have no idea of economics, and therefore they will not take the decisions that they need to move the economy ahead, like a price mechanism, like a convertible ruble, like a banking system, etc. So I asked Mr. Stalin, tell me, who are 3 politicians in the Soviet Union who understand economics? And he said, Gorbachev, Gorbachev, Gorbachev. The decision taken by Mr. Gorbachev last week, which was to split the difference between the Stalin plan and the so-called Ryzhkov plan, which relies and continues to rely on central planning, is, in my view, a refutation of Mr. Stalin's confidence in Mr. Gorbachev. Indeed, I think that the only way the Soviet Union is going to move into the 21st century as a healthy society is if they dramatically cut their defense budget and they take these radical reform measures, moving to a market economy. And only they can do that. We can't do that. Now, if an American businessman wants to invest money in the Soviet Union, fine, be my guest. You can go outside to Birchwood Manor tonight and burn a wad of $1,000 bills. Be my guest. It's a free world. But don't come to me as a U.S. Senator and say, bail me out of a bad investment. If things don't change in the Soviet Union, I frankly think it's not going to be easy to make money, and I don't think they're going to get much investment. If things change, then you will see investment.
I have to stop you, Senator.
In the
Your
Soviet
time
Union.
is up, Mrs. Whitman.
Well, I think we need to understand that Mikhail Gorbachev won the Nobel Prize for peace, not for economics. And I think part of his problem is just that he has not been willing to move all the way toward a market economy. He is straddling the command economy and the market economy, and that simply is not going to work. But beyond cutting their military budget, which they certainly should, they have proposed 5% cuts over the next few years, and they need to go far beyond that. They also should be looking to cut the aid that they are giving to communist governments throughout the world. In the third world, they are still pouring a great deal of aid into Cuba, into Libya. We have to remember that in Iraq, while it's nice that Gorbachev is on our side, there are still advisors, Soviet advisors there that he hasn't pulled out yet. They have many ways that they can get better control over their economy and put more money into their economy before we should be in trying to bail them out.
In this portion of the debate, we have time for one last question from the members of our panel. Michael, Aron, your question for Mrs. Whitman.
Mrs. Whitman, I want to ask you about international terrorism, but a difference occurred between you and Senator Bradley that I think is worth hearing more about, and that is why a state energy master plan sat on your desk when you were president of the Board of Public Utilities.
Well, I'm glad you asked that because, first of all, it's interesting that Governor Florio has clearly come into the senatorial race, because I got that very question from a reporter the other day who told me he'd been asked to ask it by Florio's front office. So I'm glad to know that we're all in this together as part of New Jersey. That plan, when it first came forward, was totally unacceptable. And we went back and started to re-look at it. And then we were at the point to reintroduce it, and there was an election that took place. And administrations changed. And since I believe that the current administration, that the new administration had a right to see what the energy plan was going to be, I talked with my successor at the board and I said, do you want us to pass on this energy plan because we're ready to go with it, or do you want to have an opportunity with the new administration to take a look and put your own stamp of approval on that plan? And he asked that they get to put their own stamp of approval on the plan.
Time for rebuttal, Senator
So there
Bradley.
is a state master plan. That's the answer.
Ask
For
Governor
whatever
Florio.
reason.
He's
For
the one who
whatever
wanted
reason.
it that
Now,
way.
I think one of the jobs of a U.S. senator is to begin to think for the long term, to begin to think beyond today, and to do things to protect the country against crises of the future. When I came into office in 1979, we had an oil supply disruption. We didn't have any oil in stockpile. I said we should put oil in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I went to see Sheikh Zaki Yamani in Saudi Arabia. He said, no, don't put oil in stockpile. I said, why? It would help us, protect us. He said, no, but we think it'd be better if you got oil from us. I said, no good. We're going to put oil in stockpile. And we have. And for 10 years I've worked on this, and we now have over 600 million barrels of oil. That's 75 days of imports. That's over 500 days of imports from Iraq and Kuwait. And it's a tool to be used during an oil supply disruption. And that is why President Bush should have used it to prevent the billions of dollars of loss that people in this country have had to pay from higher oil prices in the last 3 to 4 months.
My, how the time has flown by. It's now time for the candidates to question each other in the crossfire segment of this forum this evening. A coin toss has again determined the order. Senator Bradley, you have the first question to Mrs. Whitman. There is 90 seconds for reply and 60 seconds again for rebuttal.
Mrs. Whitman, you say you support Secretary Cheney's plan to cut the defense budget, which includes $30 billion for the B-2 stealth bomber. You say we need the B-2 bomber to deter the Soviet Union. At the same time, you say we should be balancing the budget. People of New Jersey deserve to know what you think the B-2 stealth bomber can do that cruise missiles couldn't do at 1/10 the cost.
Well, I can tell you one thing that the situation in Iraq has shown us that the B-2 bomber can do that nothing else can do, which is fly from here to Iraq without having to stop, because they can be refueled in midair. Then they can come in under the radar, and they could make strategic strikes. So I think that there's very definitely a difference between the two, and it's naive to presume there isn't. But I have never said that we need 35 B-2s. I disagree with that. I think 15 is probably enough, and that's what most of the Congress and the United States Senate has determined to be the appropriate amount. So you know perfectly well that I haven't said that we need hundreds of these, but I do think there is definitely, and it's shown, what's happened in the world today has shown the advantage of having that ability to make those kinds of strategic strikes that bomber presents us with.
Senator Bradley.
I don't think the president wants a B-2 bomber for Iraq. The B-2 stealth bomber is for the sole purpose of penetrating Soviet airspace and dropping nuclear weapons. Now, we got plenty of things to do that, particularly B-1 bombers with air-launched cruise missiles. We have adequate delivery mechanisms. But the real point here is a certain inconsistency, and I'm being kind with that word, on spending cuts. Because she says she's for a balanced budget, but she won't tell us how to balance the budget. She's for gold-plated weapons systems that mission could have been done for 1/10 the cost with other weapon systems. And frankly, I think that there is a real problem here. I want a strong defense. I don't want a wasteful defense. And if you're going to balance the budget, why won't you use a weapon system that is outmoded and ill-fitted and unneeded? Why not eliminate the B-2 bomber and save $30 billion for New Jersey taxpayers?
Mrs. Whitman, your question for Senator Bradley.
Okay, Bill, I'm going to make this easy for you. It's a national question, an international question. We've talked tonight about competitiveness in a changing world. We've asked and touched on a number of different areas there. Do you feel that if you and the rest of your brethren in Congress were to pass a national tax package similar to that Governor Florio passed here in the United States, in New Jersey, that we would be more competitive in the world?
Well, that's a creative way to ask the question.
They expected it of me.
But the fact of the matter is I voted against a tax package in Washington just last week that essentially raised taxes on middle-income taxpayers to pay for tax breaks for wealthy oil and gas investors and energy investors, and increased loopholes and in the process of increasing loopholes, reduced efficiency in the economy. I believe that the best possible tax rate is the lowest possible tax rate. I passed a major law that reduced tax rates more than in any time since World War II. Now, in terms of competitiveness, that's a serious problem. The first thing we got to do is get our budget balanced. Mrs. Whitman hasn't told us how to do that. She claims she wants a constitutional balanced budget, but she hasn't told us how to do that. Next thing we got to do is keep the world trading system open. The next thing we have to do is engage competition, not come to government for subsidies to bail out this industry or that industry, not have excessive litigation, not have excessive tax breaks. What we need is an educational system that will produce people who can man an increasingly sophisticated economy. Now, if we're talking about competitiveness, we need a better education system, we need a budget with a much lower budget deficit, and we need to keep the trading system open. That would begin to head us in the right direction. And yes, I don't think we need the tax bill that is before the Congress right now, and I voted against it because it would raise taxes on middle-income taxpayers while protecting the tax breaks of oil and gas investors.
I think it's interesting that Bill keeps talking about the fact that he says haven't offered how to balance the budget when I've talked about the same kinds of things you talked about of defense cutting and agriculture. But if the Congress would just accept the first proposal that I make, which is to keep fiscal year 91 spending to 1990 levels, we'd be looking at potential savings of over $70 billion.
500,
for all
you gotta get
the
500.
mess. For all the mess and the time that Congress has taken to come to a budget package, which I think is outrageous, they're only talking about saving, at best, in the next year, $50 billion or $40 billion at the most. So we're ahead of the game right there with what I've proposed. I have also made the other proposals, and you know it. The real problem is we have a Congress that won't begin to look at itself, won't accept responsibility for its waste and its spending, and doesn't ever meet this problem head-on, but hides from it every time.
It's now time for closing statements from the candidates. Senator Bradley, you won all of these coin tosses. You also won this one to go first.
I think I lost them.
You have 2
frankly.
minutes for a closing statement.
I want to thank everyone involved tonight, and in particular the people of New Jersey, for giving me the opportunity to serve them in the U.S. Senate. For America to shape a new world that's emerging, we're going to have to see the future clearly. To protect our environment, we're going to have to stop being the #1 polluter and start leading the world by example to a cleaner future. To promote economic growth, we're going to have to keep the trading system open and restore balance to our own domestic economy. To ensure our security, we must not remain fixated on old threats that are disappearing, but mobilize to counter new threats, such as petty dictatorships becoming terrorist states and the proliferation of nuclear and chemical weapons. And above all, we're going to have to stop seeing the world as a series of unending problems on the evening TV news. And we're going to have to start seeing the new possibilities. A race for the U.S. Senate is about who the people of New Jersey want in Washington, making the tough choices about their future. And nobody knows what's going to happen in the next 6 years. Just think, a year ago we didn't have 200,000 troops in the Persian Gulf. So ultimately, this is a race about whose judgment the people trust and whom they want making what could be life and death decisions about their future. During the last year, I woke more than once to news of people marching in the streets, some dying for what we have, a democratic process. At those moments, I'm reminded I'm at a special part and a unique part of that process between the people and their elected representatives.
Senator Bradley, I have to
That's
stop
why
you.
being U.S. Senator from New Jersey is a special trust, a
Mrs.
trust to
Whitman,
which I give my absolute
your turn
integrity.
for
I
Senator.
don't want to sort of do it while he's talking, because
We will give you the full 2 minutes.
Well, you can
Thank
tune
you.
in WOR and see it. It was
Oh, you can watch too.
Mrs.
The
Whitman.
most profound development since World War II has been the failure of communism. We see it every day. The challenge now before us is to prove that freedom works. Tonight's the last time that Bill Bradley and I will be together on this kind of a forum, and I want to take this opportunity to express my respect for him. I believe that he sincerely believes in his positions. But those positions have become increasingly, over the last 6 years, a defense of the status quo. Now more than ever in this changing world, we need to change the way we do business. We cannot condone a Congress that is failing democracy. And we are being let down by our congressional leadership, Bill Bradley included. But let me tell you what I want, what I stand for, and people can make their own choice. I support a balanced budget law to force limits on government spending. Something is very wrong when the federal agencies must close their doors because we don't have the money. As your senator, I'll propose an amendment to cut Congress's own $2 billion budget. Ironically, the Soviet Union is in the process of cutting down its bureaucracy while our Senate and Congress continue to expand theirs. Does Mr. Bradley really need a staff of 50 to let you and me know that the world is changing? Does Bill and his fellow incumbents have to spend $100 million a year of our money to tell us that the Cold War is over? Finally, I'll support a limit on terms in office. I believe my opponent is one of the best examples of how 12 years in Washington can change well-intentioned people into status quo politicians. As much as we have witnessed a revolution of freedom across this world, we need a revolution in Congress.
We have come to the end of tonight's U.S. Senate debate on foreign policy issues. Our thanks to the New Jersey Chamber of Commerce for sponsoring this event, and a special thanks to our candidates, Mrs. Whitman and Mr. Bradley, for being here to discuss the issues with us. Panel members, I'd like to thank you, Jane Allen of the Associated Press, Michael Aron, New Jersey Network News, Bill Beutel, Channel 7 Eyewitness News in New York, and Jim Gardner, Channel 6 WPVI Action News in Philadelphia. Your questions, your insightful questions, have helped to make us all better informed citizens. Well, you have heard the discussion this evening. You have heard the issues, and now it's up to you. Election Day, November 6th, is just 2 weeks away. We urge you to get out and vote. Thank you all for being here, and our viewers at home, we hope you're better informed. I'm Kent Manahan. Good night.
I'm Trish DeGaspers, back in the Trenton studio. The Bradley-Whitman debate may have concluded, but our coverage is far from over. In just a few minutes, we'll have a special hour-long New Jersey Network News with debate highlights and analysis. We'll also have the rest of the day's news, sports, weather, and business. But first, we're going to go to correspondent Larry Stupnagel, who has some thoughts on tonight's debate. Larry?
That's right, Trish. We just saw the second and so far scheduled final debate between Senator Bill Bradley and challenger Christine Todd Whitman. There are no other debates scheduled, and chances are we're not going to see any more. There are a couple of more joint appearances. I think tomorrow night we've got some phone-in programs for both of the candidates, but that was it for tonight. I didn't see any knockout blows delivered by either one of the candidates, not enough there to hurt either one of their candidacies, and certainly not Senator Bill Bradley, who remains far out in front. He merely had to look senatorial tonight. Christine Whitman had to look like she was his equal standing up there. A pretty tough task given the fact that Bradley is known for his international expertise. Joining me now for their thoughts on what they saw tonight are our analysts for this thing, Democrat Jim McQueenie and Republican Roger Bodman. Gentlemen, what'd you think? Roger, we talked on the earlier newscast tonight. How'd your candidate do?
I think she did just fine. Again, you pointed out that there was no knockout blow, but rarely in this kind of circumstances there ever a knockout blow, and I don't think anyone, particularly Christy Whitman, expected that to happen, Larry. The fact of the matter is she conducted herself in a sophisticated, intelligent, and well-informed manner. She looked good. She came across intelligently, and I assume that her political people and advisors are very pleased with her performance, as they should be.
And Jim McQueenie, how'd your man do?
Well, I think Bill did exceptionally well. I think he did better in this debate than he did in the first one. I think your statement before that a challenger, Mrs. Whitman, has to do exceptionally well against an incumbent like Bill Bradley, and this is probably her last exposure, significant television exposure. She had to do not just good, Raj, in all honesty, she had to do great to really bring things a little closer than they appear they're going to be.
Were you surprised at the initial opening statements? Senator Bradley almost sort of deflected attention away from the Middle East, I thought, and sort of turned it back onto a domestic issue as to how are we going to spend our peace dividend. That caught me a little off guard given the topics tonight were supposed to be international relations. Jim, why do you think he did that?
Well, I think one of the things was you really got to try bring this debate down to a calmness. This debate, you really wanted to design it away from some sort of passion. In a way, to be cruel, dullness in this debate goes to Bill's favor and not to Mrs. Whitman's favor.
Right. And how do you think Mrs. Whitman handled that? She brought it back. I think her line was that we're the last remaining superpower.
Right. Well, I think again, you know, that I almost got a sense in this debate, Larry, that both of them, to a degree, certainly Mrs. Whitman would have loved to have strayed off onto the domestic issues, most notably the tax issue. In fact, she did manage to weave it in a few times. I think there was almost a pulling and a tugging. There was more agreement than disagreement. Clearly, the situation in the Persian Gulf dominated. Obviously, it is the international crisis of the moment, and it should have dominated and did. I think that the fact of the matter is that there was a willingness and almost an attempt to try to pull this thing off onto certain domestic issues. You saw Bill Bradley raise the issue of state energy policy and criticize Mrs. Whitman in that regard. Interestingly, he again did not voice his opinion on the Governor Floyer's taxes.
Why, interestingly? He sort of avoided that the whole way through, hasn't he?
He clearly has, and you know, though he did talk in this debate about his concern for low taxes and low tax rates, presumably at the national level, but I can only guess that he doesn't have such the same feeling as to the state level.
Is that a smart move on his part to avoid it?
To
the state taxes? The state tax?
Avoid it?
Yeah, the state tax. The Florio question.
The answer is that yes, it's a smart move, given the political environment at the moment. One of the things.
But doesn't it backfire against you? I mean, that's something that's on people's minds.
Don't think so. You want to keep it to his strength, and he did that. And the foreign affairs really played to his strength. And I think, frankly,
you know, the foreign affairs really played to his strength simply because he didn't have to.
I'm going to have to show a little restraint here. We're out of time for this segment of the program. We'll be back in just a few minutes, and for the moment now, let's throw it back to Trish DeGaspers.
Thanks, Larry. Besides debate highlights, we'll also have the rest of the day's news, sports, weather, and business, so stay tuned to NJN. We'll be back right after the lottery.